We have arrived. Sounded creepy, didn't it? Mieko Kawakami is my favourite Japanese author. I don't know when this happened. It didn't happen the moment that I finished reading Breasts and Eggs, which was her last novel to be translated into English by Sam Bett and David Boyd this time last year. It wasn't then. It was as I digested that novel over weeks and even months, and I realised what an impact it had had on me as a reader, as a lover of Japanese culture and Japanese fiction, as a feminist, as a writer. I realised that this book had had a profound effect on me. Even though we don't have as many works from Kawakami in English as we do from other Japanese authors, like my other favourite, Yoko Ogawa, which I've done an entire video dedicated to her works and her as a person, Mieko Kawakami, every word that she writes is important, is impactful, is unique, is genius. I don't use that word lightly. I cringe when people use that word lightly. Mieko Kawakami is a genius. This is heaven. And it is heaven. It's also hell. Heaven is the latest novel written by Mieko Kawakami to be translated into English, again by Sam Bett and David Boyd. As I understand it from a friend of mine who's also a Japanese to English translator, Sam Bett and David Boyd shared translation duty on this and Breasts and Eggs by dividing it up where one of them tackles all of the narrative and the other tackles the dialogue. I don't know which did which, but as far as I know, that's how they work as a pair of translators, and it definitely works. Breasts and Eggs was a pair of novels. It was originally one short novel that then had a sequel, and when we got it in English translation, both of those were translated together and bound together by Picador as one pretty lengthy novel, but it is effectively two novels. Heaven is one single novel that reaches about 170 pages, and it is harrowing, it is heartbreaking, it is distressing, it is difficult, it made me cry. It's a really raw and intense novel. Now, Mieko Kawakami is what I would describe as a punk author. I've described her as a feminist in the past, and as far as I know, she doesn't actually like that term. She doesn't like to be described as a feminist author, because I guess she's bigger than that. I can't disagree. This is not a particularly feminist novel. The protagonist is a teenage boy who's being bullied. Heaven tells the story of a young, nameless 14-year-old, and it's set somewhere, I think, in the 90s. They reference 1999 being in the future, but I don't know exactly when it is set. Our protagonist is being drastically bullied at school. Now, I'll talk a little bit in a sec about how I was bullied at school, and therefore I related pretty heavily to this book, but I wasn't bullied in the way that our protagonist in Heaven was bullied. He is bullied in a way that I can't even imagine. But when the book begins, he has received a letter from a girl in his class called Kojima, and Kojima is also being bullied by the girls in her class. Pretty much all the boys gang up on him, and all the girls gang up on her. He's bullied, he believes, because he has a lazy eye. And he's had this lazy eye since he was 3 years old, and the boys pick on him for it and they call him Eyes. Kojima is bullied because she's scrawny, she smells bad, and she was there. And this is something we'll get to later on, is that these two are bullied because they were there. And that quite often is the case with bullying. But our protagonist gets a letter from Kojima saying that she wants to be friends. And so the novel tracks their budding relationship as friends, as they become close and bond over their shared sorrow and shared abuse, but also bond over the fact that they are young people now. They want to share their thoughts and feelings and experiences. Her especially. She's more extroverted than he is, and she teaches him a thing or two about that kind of extroversion, I guess. The titular Heaven is a painting. Pretty early on in the book, the two of them take a train journey to this gallery/museum that Kojima really likes, and she says that inside is a painting. The painting has a really boring title, but she believes that what it's describing, what it's depicting, is heaven, and she wants him to see it. But they never get to see the painting because things come up and they get into a conversation. I won't spoil it. What's interesting about the book is that I thought it was very much going to be about their relationship, about them building a relationship together, and that would be the arc of the novel, that it would build and build and build as they get closer and closer, maybe end up confronting their bullies or running away together or something. But the book is more real and grounded than that. Now, I should make it clear that Heaven is my most anticipated novel of this year. Breasts and Eggs was my favourite novel of last year. And so my hype, my anticipation for this book was pretty intense. And Picador were kind enough to send me a review copy and then even this final copy pre-release. They know my level of excitement for this, they know how dedicated I am to talking about this book, and now that I've actually read it, I am thrilled to say that it lived up to the hype, maybe even surpassed it. And it's very difficult to be objective about that and unbiased and even convincing, because it's my most anticipated book, and perhaps I'm riding the waves of my own bias. But I'm pretty good at not being biased. If an album, a book, a video game, whatever it is, comes along that I was excited for and it disappoints, I'm not going to convince myself that it's actually good and that my money was well spent. I'm not going to do that. Heaven is exactly as great as I hoped it would be. And the reason that I believe this is because it is not what I thought it would be. Because Mieko Kawakami is cleverer than that, and she subverts your expectations in a very simple way. As I said, this is a raw and grounded novel. It depicts life in a gloves-off kind of a way. As I said, I hoped that this book had a trajectory, had an arc, had a route that I could predict, but that's not the case. In fact, the relationship between our protagonist, whose lines are spoken in the first person, and Kojima, it's not what you think it's going to be. The relationship is, to a degree, what I thought it would be, but not the events of the relationship, not the things that they do together. Because this book doesn't have an issue with just leaving Kojima behind for 1 or 2 chapters and putting our protagonist in a different situation. Having him at home, talking to his parents. And we don't get to know his parents until much later in the book. This is not a novel that has a particular setup where we are introduced to his family and his friends and his personality through exposition in chapter 1 and then move into the story. No, we're thrown in at the deep end at the beginning with him getting a letter from Kojima before we even see him getting bullied. Then we see the two of them go on a little journey together. Then we see the worst of the bullying. Then we go to his house and we meet his parents. It's almost told back to front, because that's how life works. It really makes you feel like you've been thrown into a segment of this real person's real life. And the book is not concerned with whether or not this is the right kind of narrative for fiction. It makes it feel like it's not fiction. It makes it feel like it is entirely real, and that's why I'm calling it raw and grounded. If you meet a person in real life and they're getting bullied, the first thing that you might see is a friend of theirs. You might not see them getting bullied until later, and you might not meet their parents until later, until you go around their house. And that's kind of how this book makes you feel, like you are a new acquaintance of this very sad, pathetic, bullied teenage boy, and you're meeting parts of his life in whatever order they come up in. I really like that. It's a wonderful effect. As for the bullying itself, it really is intense, and it's kind of the main point of the book. He is being bullied relentlessly every day at school. He's hiding it from his parents, he's hiding it from his teachers, although, speaking as an ex-teacher, they really should have picked up on it, and they didn't. I'm not sure how much attention high school teachers and middle school teachers in Japan pay to bullied children, anorexic children, abused children, but if this book is anything to go by, it's not great. Either way, the bullying is hidden, or adults are turning a blind eye, I'm not sure. But it is very intense bullying. I won't go into too much detail, because I guess it's better if you read it for yourself. And also, I'll probably cry if I think about it too much. As I said at the beginning, I was bullied at school. I was a very, very lonely child. But in this novel, and in my life experience, people like us who get bullied at school, they find a thing to pick on. But that thing might not be the reason they pick on you in the first place. They come up with things to point out so that they can give you an offensive nickname, or shout horrible abusive things at you about your physical defects or whatever. But it's not why they started in the first place, and this book is very good at exploring the nature of bullying. You could call this a philosophical essay on bullying. It explores the causes, the means, and the behaviours of bullying and bullies. Kawakami is in the heads of these bullies, and there is a point later in the book, in the second half, where the nature of bullying is explored in a deep and detailed conversation, and that conversation is perhaps the most shocking part of the book. even though there are detailed descriptions of bullying happening, it's this conversation that really hits you, that really makes you feel sad and exhausted, I guess. But the exploration of the philosophy of bullying is not something I expected. I don't think it's something I've ever thought about or experienced or thought of experiencing in a novel before, but it's here. So our protagonist is getting bullied, and he also gets to meet the explanation behind his bullying, and he doesn't like it. Of course he doesn't like it. And in fact, it makes him question and get angry at the world, at the structure of our society, and rightly so. I feel like this review is about as mixed up as the order of narrative beats in this novel, and I apologize for that. I have a lot of thoughts, and I also don't want to spoil anything. But this book really is as incredible as I thought it was going to be. When I read Breasts and Eggs, I had a lot of thoughts to do with the role of women in society. The book explores womanhood, motherhood, sexism, and patriarchy in very, very clever ways. But none of it really surprised me. These are things that we're all aware of, but Kawakami was very good at exploring them nonetheless from her own perspective. And she did have me thinking about motherhood from a very different perspective. This book surprised me over and over again, even though I have rarely empathized with a protagonist this much. I was still shocked and surprised. If I had read this novel when I was 14 and I was getting bullied, I don't know how I would have responded to the truths and perspectives and opinions that you can find in this novel. It probably would have hurt. Heaven hurts, and that's what makes it special, I guess, as weird as it is to say that. As for the writing, I didn't notice that our protagonist was nameless for a long time. So deep into his consciousness was I. And the dialogue between characters is really a step above your average literary novel. It really is. The dialogue between Kojima and our protagonist, it is uplifting 1 minute and destructive the next. And that's how children behave. That's how teenagers talk to each other. It really is quite raw. I've used that word too many times, but it's unabashed. It concerns itself with truth rather than narrative. This is a piece of fiction that is greater than truth. This is evidence that the best way to understand and experience life and people is through made-up life and made-up people. Fiction tells the truth. This novel tells the truth about people, and it explains the truth better than your own experiences with other real people might do. Suddenly got very light and very warm. It's difficult to sometimes critique the writing of a novel in translation because the writing that you're experiencing firsthand is the writing of the translators. And so that's what I'm going to do, is just point out how Sam Bett and David Boyd as a translation team are the best in the business. I think I'm confident enough to say that now that I've read 2 things that they've translated together. It is incredible. There is so much poetry in here. These 2 have all of the creative chops of a novelist who's written 10 bestsellers over the last 20 years of their career. There is an incredible amount of nuance, personality, grit, and power to the writing in this. While the themes, personalities, the tone, the story itself, all of these I attribute to the genius of Mieko Kawakami, the words that I am reading in English, the translation by Sam Bett and David Boyd is second to none, and I cannot overemphasize what a talented team of translators they are. Heaven has been my most anticipated novel of this year since before the year began, and being able to talk about it like this is pretty intense for me, because I only get to do it once. I'm going to bring this book up again in other videos, but I have to get all my thoughts out now, and I have so many. This is a novel that I related to very, very heavily as someone who was bullied at school. It's a novel by my favorite Japanese author. But there is also something else that you need to know, and that's that this is a very difficult, sad, and raw story. When I talked about Sayaka Murata's Earthlings last year, I should have mentioned content warnings when I made a video and wrote an article about that book, because that book is dangerous in its writing and its content. It is not for everyone. I thought it was genius. It was my second favourite novel of the year. It's not for everyone. And I think I could probably do the same here. Content warning, the bullying in this novel is intense. So just bear that in mind when you go into this book. If you're someone who has been bullied, if you're a parent of a child that has been or is being bullied, there's a lot in here that could make you upset. Just bear that in mind. I cried for our protagonist, and I also cried for me 15 years ago, and the relationship between me and him. Even though, as I say, I wasn't bullied to the extent that he was, I wasn't physically bullied, only emotionally, only verbally. I say only. Still screws you up. The last thing that I really need to mention about this book is the relationship between our two protagonists. We have our protagonist, who is also our narrator, and then we have this girl, Kojima. What's interesting about the two of them is that they're not perfect people. They're victims. They are both victims of bullying, and they are both suffering in their own ways. They both have thoughts and actions and behaviours that you can see coming, but still hit you pretty hard. Their personal and private reactions to being bullied are extreme. They're also, again, familiar and things that are not difficult to imagine. But they also have ideas and perspectives that are not perfect. They are children. They are teenagers. They are inexperienced and naive people. They are people who've been pushed to the limits emotionally at a time when emotions are already high, stress levels are already high, and they don't know enough about the world to be able to rationalize their experiences, and that makes them sometimes unlikable people. Sometimes it's not nice being in our protagonist's head. You don't always like his thoughts. Kojima is the same. The things she says to him, the advice she gives him, the things that she says that she likes about him, the things that she wants out of their relationship, it's toxic. Some of it is not good. These are not supposed to be perfect people. Just because they are our protagonists, just because they are victims, doesn't mean they are perfect people, and you will dislike them at times, because you can dislike anyone at any time. None of us are perfect. And again, this is part of the genius of Mieko Kawakami. She does not set up perfect protagonists. She sets up honest ones. Being so raw and so grounded will not make this a book for everyone. It's a novel for the select few, and I'm one of them. You probably are too. I don't know if this will end up being my favourite novel of the year. We're only halfway through the year. It's my favourite Japanese novel of the year so far, as I thought it would be, and I'll be interested to see what else comes up. My most anticipated novel of 2020 wound up being my second favourite of the year, because Mieko Kawakami came into my life. So who knows what will happen next. Either way, this is a very important book. The translation is like nothing I've ever read. The way that it is plotted and structured is surprising, frustrating, goes against the rules of fiction in some ways, but it does that for the better, to represent life in a more honest and harsh way. Our characters are complex people, even the bullies to an extent, and the events of it are very, very distressing at times, so be prepared for that. It's a book that I had to put down quite a lot, just to take a little breather. But it is wonderful. Kawakami is a genius. Sam Bett and David Boyd are a perfect translation team. So as a novel, it is perfect. That doesn't mean it's going to be liked by everyone. Be prepared for that. But thank you to Mieko Kawakami for writing this, and for our translation team for doing an incredible job, and to Picador for publishing now 2 of my favourite Japanese novels of all time, and for allowing me to find a new favourite Japanese author. This is all great stuff. But I haven't been able to smile or laugh or make jokes in this video because this is a very, very dark and frightening book. But the fact that it explores the nature and philosophy of bullying, it has me rethinking my childhood and the people who bullied me. It's fascinating in that regard. It's a lot to unpack, actually. Alright, I'll stop it there, otherwise I'll just keep going forever. Heaven is amazing. If you can stomach it, you should love and appreciate it as much as I do. Thanks for watching. Read Heaven, and subscribe for books.